Okay, welcome to this Sunstone Symposium session this Saturday morning, almost afternoon. You are in session 333, Mormon Gaslighting, Testimonial Injustice, and Epistemic Violence by Kelly D. Potter. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. After the symposium, some Sunstone staff will edit, polish, and re-upload all of this year's session videos to the Whova app. It'll take about 2 weeks for everything to be available, but once it is, every video will be available to watch and rewatch in the Whova app through the end of 2021. And excuse me, if you have any questions, please type them into the Whova app, and then we will address them at the end of the session, as many as we can get through. All right, a little bit about this in presentation. In this paper, the presenter will explore some of the characteristics of Mormonism's theology, practice, and culture through the lens of social epistemology, and in particular, the concepts of gaslighting, testimonial injustice, and epistemic violence. She will show that Mormonism is guilty of all three, using particular examples as paradigms of epistemic moves that are part of its epistemic culture. The presenter will employ the methodology of standpoint epistemology and will think through these issues from the point of view of LGBTQ+ members of the community. Despite Mormonism's claim that each member can have the personal witness of the Holy Ghost concerning matters in their own lives, the epistemic practices of the LDS Church and the Mormon culture show otherwise. For example, although a transgender person might have the experience that they are not the gender assigned to them at birth, this experience is automatically negated by claims made by church leadership. This is a case of gaslighting, testimonial injustice, and epistemic violence rolled up into one. Other cases will be explored as well. The conclusion that the presenter draws is that Mormon LDS culture is epistemically vicious. And a little bit introduction about our presenter. Kelly D. Potter is Associate Professor of Philosophy and former Mormon Studies Coordinator at Utah Valley University, where she also serves on the Religious Studies Board. She is author of numerous articles on Mormon theology and philosophy, including the recent Trans and Mutuable Bodies in the recently published The Routledge Handbook of Mormonism and Gender. She is currently writing a book on heterodoxy and its implications for the nature of religious belief. Thank you so much, Kelly, for being here, and we will give the floor to you.
Thank you, Heidi, for chairing this session. And I also want to thank Lindsay Hanson-Park and Grace Poole for a great Sunstone Symposium this year. Now, unfortunately, I didn't do a PowerPoint. I had originally wanted to, but I didn't have the time. So I'm going to read through the paper because it's pretty informal. And you'll just have to look at me while I'm reading or just listen. I'm sorry about that. So let's start with the concept of gaslighting. This term was based on the 1944 film Gaslight, starring Ingrid Bergman. In this film, a man named Sergius kills a world-famous opera singer named Alice in an attempt to steal her precious jewels. But Sergius is interrupted by Alice's niece, Paula, and doesn't have time to find the jewels. And of course, escapes. Paula is then sent to Italy to study opera singing. Alice was a famous opera singer. The film jumps to when Paula is an adult and marries a man named Gregory, who actually is Sergius. The couple moves back to to the London house where Sergius killed Alice. Sergius then proceeds to isolate Paula from the rest of the world and engage in psychological manipulation to make Paula question her sanity. When she hears Sergius in the attic at night bumping around, trying to move objects, or trying to find where Alice hid the jewels, he tells her that it is all in her head. He even intentionally moves objects and later tells Paula that she has moved them in an apparent effort to get her to think that she is not sane. The film's name comes from the fact that when Sergius turns on the lights in the attic, the lights in the rest of the house flicker due to there being gas lights. Something that Paula reports to Sergius, but who then, of course, denies it. Sergius's psychological manipulation is now seen as a paradigm of what therapists, psychologists, and philosophers have called gaslighting. So gaslighting involves one person raising questions about or invalidating someone else's cognition in some way. In the subfield of social epistemology, gaslighting is often seen as a type of epistemic injustice. That is, where an economy of knowledge is unfair to some group of people. For example, the fact that doctors in the US have been shown to give less credence to someone's claim to be experiencing significant pain if they are Black. Thus, one species of epistemic injustice is testimonial injustice. This concept comes from Miranda Fricker's work and involves the idea that someone's testimony gets less credibility due to who they are as based on a stereotype. Clearly, testimonial injustice plays a role in questions about social justice. One might suffer from testimonial injustice if one is Black, a woman, working class, a Muslim, or a member of the LGBTQ community. As for gaslighting, philosopher Kate Abramson says, the central desire or aim of the gaslighter, to put it sharply, is to destroy even the possibility of disagreement, to have his sense of the world not merely confirmed, but placed beyond dispute. And the only way to accomplish this is for there to be no source of possible disagreement, no independent, separate, deliberative perspective from which disagreement might arise. So he gaslights. He aims to destroy the possibility of disagreement by so radically undermining another person that she has nowhere left to stand from which to disagree, no standpoint from which her words might constitute genuine disagreement. On this view of gaslighting, it's the process of setting up testimonial injustice by questioning the rationality of the marginalized group or person that is being gaslit. Similarly, Veronica Ivy argues that gaslighting is an instance of testimonial injustice. She writes, I'm interested in the more subtle form, often unintentional, where a hearer doesn't believe or expresses doubt about a speaker's testimony. In this epistemic form of gaslighting, the hearer of a testimony raises doubts about the speaker's reliability at perceiving events accurately. Directly or indirectly, then, gaslighting involves expressing doubts that harm or are an injustice, or sorry, that the harm or injustice that the speaker is testifying to really happened as the speaker claims. Ivy gives, end quote. Ivy gives an example where a trans woman is misgendered by her coworker and tells another coworker, whom she takes to be a trans ally, about the incident. The ally proceeds to doubt whether the former coworker really misgendered her. Ivy takes this to be a paradigmatic case of gaslighting, and it's clearly a case of testimonial injustice. In later work, following Christy Dodson, another feminist philosopher, these are all feminist philosophers that I'm referring to right now. Ivy modifies her approach to argue that gaslighting should be understood as a kind of epistemic violence that causes PTSD. Ivy argues, along with Dotson, and I'm skipping this quote from Dotson, that gaslighting harms a person not just as a knower, but as a person. That is, gaslighting harms one's agency. It's in this way that it should be characterized as violence specifically, and not just as injustice generally. So I've given you kind of an incomplete account of the philosophical discussion on gaslighting that's going on in the literature for the last decade, which is really recent for philosophy, right? And also on testimonial injustice and epistemic violence. But because of time, I don't have, we can't go into more than this, but there's other interesting things going on in social epistemology. I think that we also need to ensure that we do not understand gaslighting as something that happens between individuals only, isolated from their context, but as something that is systematically enabled. The fact that Sergius is a man and Paula is a woman is not inconsequential for the former's ability to gaslight the latter. Gaslighting can be embedded in an ideology or a doxastic economy or an economy of belief. That is, the relations of the production of beliefs among a community of persons. That's what I mean by doxastic economy. So for example, the claim that Black folk are overly passionate, irrational was part of the American ideology that justified ignoring their testimonies and experiences. Something similar can be said about gender ideology as well. In theistic communities, one might argue that certain theodicies, that is, responses to the problem of evil, in effect gaslight those that have experienced horrendous evil. So it seems clear that we must take into account the fact that systemic gaslighting exists. I'm not going to try to give a final definition of gaslighting for the purposes of this paper. It should be clear that what we're calling gaslighting here involves testimonial injustice and also epistemic violence. But most importantly, it involves the attempt to undermine the agency and even the personhood of someone or some group. Roughly, I'm going to say that the systemic gaslighting of a group of people happens in the event that an ideology or epistemic economy incorporates content that at least implicitly questions the capacities and or agency of that group. Okay, so let's talk about some examples now that I've got the more abstract philosophical part out of the way. So examples of Mormon gaslighting. One example of Mormon gaslighting is what I'll call teleological theodicy. In this form of gaslighting, one member has had something very tragic happen in their lives or in their life, and another member, often in a pastoral role, tells them that it's part of God's plan. So, concrete example, a 7-year-old child in the ward gets leukemia and dies. People in the ward tell the family that their son was called on a mission in the next life and that he was not meant to have a long life or long mortal life. It was all part of God's plan. This negates the parent's feeling of great loss, that something terribly wrong has happened. This is a case of gaslighting because the propriety of the parent's response to their child's death is undermined by the idea that it was part of God's plan. They should be happy, not devastated. Teleological theodicy is not unique to Mormonism, and is, in fact, a typical form of theological gaslighting in most of Christianity, at least from the time of Bishop Irenaeus, who seems to have first formulated this approach to understanding evil. So I want to turn to an example of gaslighting that is peculiarly Mormon. So Elder David Bednar is an apostle of the LDS Church and is infamous for giving a general conference talk entitled, "And Nothing Shall Offend Them." The title of the talk is a reference to the King James Version translation of Psalm 119, 165, which states, "Great peace have they which love thy law, and nothing shall offend them." It's worth noting that there are other ways to translate this. The NIV translation says, quote, "Great peace have those who love your law, and nothing can make them stumble," end quote. I'll leave it to experts such as David Bokovoy to interpret the actual Hebrew here, but it seems clear that the passage can be understood as not referring to offense at all. Of course, I'm more interested in how Bednar uses the idea. So he says, quote, "When we believe or say we have been offended, we usually mean we feel insulted, mistreated, snubbed, or disrespected. And certainly clumsy, embarrassing, unprincipled, and mean-spirited things do occur in our interactions with other people that would allow us to take offense. However, it ultimately is impossible for another person to offend you or me. Indeed, believing that another person offends us is fundamentally false. To be offended is a choice we make. It is not a condition inflicted or imposed upon us by someone or something else." Now, to understand how this is a case of gaslighting, we need to look at the context. In Bednar's talk, he's complaining about members who quit attending church because someone offended them. There's a wide range of things that could offend people at church. For example, one might be offended by the bad fashion choices of the other members, as I am. This is a relatively minor offense, but it could also be something that is not so minor. Just to take one possible example, imagine the case of a member who has cerebral palsy, whom the members in the ward refer to as the cripple. Even saying that bugs me, sorry. It is important to note that there is a wide range of actions that can be offensive, and not all of them are morally equivalent. Now, Bednar defines being offended as the feeling of being insulted, mistreated, snubbed, or disrespected. He then goes on to assert that being offended is a choice. One might wonder whether feelings are chosen. Fear is one of the most fundamental feelings, and it would seem that it's not a choice. Yes, we can learn to control our feelings over time, but many, if not most of them, happen to us and are not in any way actions or active, but rather passions with the implied passivity. Bednar then nonsensically asserts that we actually can't be offended by others because it's a choice on our part to take offense. Here it seems like he's getting hung up on the passive voice and offended by others. The word offense and its cognates can be active, of course, and Bednar himself uses the word in an active way, to take offense. Indeed, if taking offense is a choice, which let's grant that, and we do take offense sometimes, man, I do a lot, then Bednar is dead wrong on this point. It is not impossible to be offended by others, that is, to take offense. We do it all the time. Perhaps Bednar really means to say that since no one can force us to take offense, we should never do so. This seems to be a more charitable reading of what he's saying than interpreting his words more literally, like I just did. But now one might wonder whether this is correct or not. Surely taking offense is the proper response to the case of the member with cerebral palsy. Or perhaps a better example would be the following case. Imagine that someone affixed images of pornography all over Bednar's house, how should he react to such images? Given his sensibilities, I would imagine that he would be offended by the images. It seems that by his lights, pornography is offensive, and so the proper reaction would be to take offense. Moreover, wouldn't it be accurate to say that Jesus was offended by money changers in the temple? And wasn't he right to take offense? It seems clear to me that there is an element of bad faith in Bednar's claim in this talk. He doesn't really believe what he says. But how is this gaslighting? Of course, there was an element of bad faith in Sergius's gaslighting Paula. Sergius knew damn well that Paula was hearing noises from the attic and seeing the lights flicker. But he denied this in an attempt to get her to doubt herself. So why does Bednar want people to believe that they should never take offense? As I mentioned above, the context is where members of the church have quit attending due to taking offense at something the church or a member has done. Bednar is recommending that bishops respond to members that have taken offense in the following way. So imagine that we have Sherry, and she says to the bishop, I took offense at X, whatever X is. And the bishop responds by saying, being offended is a choice. You don't have to choose to be offended. So that's sort of the abstract structure of what Bednar wants the bishop to do. In this case, it is implied that taking offense at X is wrong. So the bishop is questioning the propriety of Sherry's feelings on the matter. Since Sherry's feelings are being negated, this is a paradigmatic case of gaslighting. What if X, the thing that offended Sherry, was that she was sexually abused by one of the youth leaders in the ward? If any action is offensive, then the sexual abuse of a minor is. Such a bishop would be gaslighting Sherry, since he would be questioning her ability to determine what is offensive. This is what Bednar wants. Those of us that have lived in the Mormon community know well that this tactic is used by true believing Mormons to question the credibility of people who have left the church for whatever reason. This is used systematically against those who have been marginalized by the church, whether they be indigenous people, Blacks, women, LGBTQIA people, or victims of sexual abuse. Of course, anyone in the Mormon adjacent world has to deal with this type of gaslighting, which I hereby dub Bednar's offense. It's an example of systemic gaslighting in that it has become part of the Mormon discourse to use this method of invalidating the feelings of members that have been wronged by the church. It's been used against me at least a dozen times. Another example of systemic gaslighting in Mormon culture would be passive aggression. Side note, it's pretty obvious why Mormons are very passive aggressive. They believe contention is of the devil, and so one mustn't be actively or explicitly aggressive. Passive aggression involves expressing negative emotions or disagreement indirectly rather than directly. It is often difficult to identify passive aggression since it can be communicated by tone. And this gives the passive aggressor the ability to deny that the aggression has really occurred. In this way, passive aggression is a setup for gaslighting. You're just imagining that my tone was sarcastic. This is exactly what Mormons need in order to be aggressive without being contentious. Be passively aggressive and deny it later. Sometimes gaslighting in Mormonism takes a more subtle, implicit form. To illustrate, I want to focus on the treatment of LGBTQIA persons associated or raised in the Mormon community. I believe that similar observations, by the way, would apply to Black and Indigenous people of color in the church, but I'm going to leave that discussion to them. Since I'm a member of the LGBTQ community, it makes sense for me to talk about it from that perspective. One example of the Mormon gaslighting of the LGBTQIA community is the idea that sexual orientation is a choice and can be changed. This is gaslighting because it's contrary to the experience of lesbians and gay men. In fact, reparative or conversion therapy itself involves gaslighting the victim. Quote, "You are gay because there's some kind of traumatic sexual event in your life," end quote. They call that like the root of it, of your same-sex attraction problem. Another example of church gaslighting, the LGBTQIA community, is the infamous Proclamation on the Family, and actually stuff surrounding it. This document was written to give a theological basis for the LDS Church to make the legal argument that allowing gay marriage violates Mormons' religious liberty. The focus was gay marriage, and that'll be significant in a minute. Now, this document consciously rests the Mormon plan of salvation on heteronormativity, thus making same-sex relationships out of order. And that's what it's intended to do. It also asserts gender complementarianism and binarism, which has always been clearly part of Mormon theology and practice. Always with the heterodox tradition, though. Now, imagine what it would be like to read this document as a trans woman or a trans man. It says that gender is an essential and eternal component of one's premortal, mortal, and postmortal existence. It would seem to follow that one's spirit could be female and one's body male. I mean, the idea of gendered spirits practically begs for the possibility of a mismatch between spirit and body. Interestingly, some trans people have used this way of characterizing their experience. I have a feminine soul. And not just trans women that are Mormons, but lots of trans women have described their experience that way, especially in the past. Recall that the purpose of the proclamation was to justify rejection of gay marriage, and so the authors weren't thinking about the trans experience. Otherwise, they would have included the claim that there could be no mismatch between the gender of one's spirit and the sex gender of one's body. Of course, the proclamation was written in 1994 and 95, and trans issues were not yet front and center. The church became interested in trans issues after the turning point for trans visibility, marked by Caitlyn Jenner coming out and Laverne Cox on Orange is the New Black, and that time period. The church found that they had a hard time excluding trans people based on the proclamation. And this is what prompted Elder Dallin Oaks to eventually, after saying, well, we need to think about this for a while, to eventually make the claim that the meaning of gender in the proclamation is biological sex assigned at birth. Of course, one's gender is also eternal, and biological sex is anything but eternal. Oakes's interpretation is clearly a reinterpretation of the words in the proclamation. This practice of changing what one means with certain words is a special form of gaslighting. I want to call it equivocal gaslighting. Such a gaslighter says something and then later denies it. Denies that it has the evident or original intended meaning. So, for example, take the case of the famous invisible gardener thought experiment by John Wisdom. Two men come upon a plot of land that they had abandoned years before, and they find it to be surprisingly vibrant. One of them says, "There's a gardener that tends this plot." The other balks at the idea. They wait for weeks to see if a gardener shows up, but no one ever shows up to tend the plot. Now this should be the end of the question, and the men should go on their way. However, in wisdom's imagined case, the believer responds to the lack of evidence for a gardener by saying that the gardener in this case is invisible and not otherwise detectable, but yet tends to the garden. The skeptic rightly points out that nothing remains now of the original claim. In this case, I think the believer is gaslighting the skeptic. First, the believer asserts that there's a gardener of the normal sort, like a human being. But then later, the believer asserts that the gardener is nothing like a normal human being. The believer is moving the goalposts. Oakes changes the meaning of gender in order to avoid a consequence that the leadership of the church cannot possibly allow. He claims that this is what the proclamation always meant, despite the text itself saying things that seem to contradict that interpretation, namely that gender is eternal. And this is not the end of Oakes's gaslighting. It's important to note it is not totally clear what biological sex at birth is supposed to mean. Does it mean the chromosomes that one has? Well, some cis women, as in not trans women, have XY chromosomes, right? If they have androgen insensitivity syndrome, they will be born looking like a girl, and they'll be assigned girl, but they'll find out at puberty that they're not quite like other girls, right? But that's the sex gender that they were assigned at birth. And they have XY chromosomes. And some cis men with Klinefelter syndrome have 2X chromosomes. Of course, they also have a Y. But the 2X mean that they have biological issues that cis men normally don't have to deal with, like possibly having one ovary and infertility, of course. Same with androgen insensitive women. So that means it's not about chromosomes, it's got to be about sex assigned at birth by the doctor. That's what Oakes is talking about. He's saying whatever the doctor said, that's what it is. Okay, but now this is why I kept saying LGBTQIA. I stands for intersex, A stands for asexual, or there's other things it might stand for, but I for intersex. I wanted to really talk about them too. For a long time, the established medical practice in the case of infants with ambiguous genitalia was to use a ruler to measure the phallus, and if it was long enough, then they would assign male to the baby with female assigned otherwise. So basically they just measure it, see how long it is, and make a decision. And then they would proceed with reconstructive surgery to make the infant's genitalia appear more like the gender assigned. The parents would be sent home with the instructions to raise the child as a boy or a girl, respectively. However, unsurprisingly, there was a problem with this approach. About 10% of intersex people on whom genital surgery was performed found that they identified with the other gender, which of course makes them trans. And as with transgender people, they experience gender dysphoria, which comes with the 40% chance of a suicide attempt if left untreated, where the treatment is validation and often medical transition. You want to know more? Google David Reimer. This problem has led the medical establishment to begin to question the practices of gender assignment and surgery in the case of infants with ambiguous genitalia. But what would Oakes say about the ones who were victimized by this practice? Are they right about their gender? Or did the doctor at birth get it right? If Oakes answers by favoring the doctor's assignment, then Oakes is negating the intersex person's own experience of their gender. And given the idea that members of the church have the right to receive personal revelation about their own lives, we end up with another case of equivocal gaslighting. In essence, Oakes is saying, you can receive personal revelation about your life unless it's about your gender. He didn't really mean it. Let me elaborate on this latter point because I really want to emphasize it. Mormonism is committed to the possibility of personal revelation from God via the Holy Ghost. They use the old 19th century terminology. Every member has the right to personal revelation about decisions in their lives or decisions that they might make in their church callings, but their stewardship. Of course, this opens up the possibility that personal revelation will conflict with leadership mandates. So let's consider how this would affect the intersex person that was assigned the wrong gender at birth. Let's call her Indra. So Indra is a member of the church and understands about personal revelation and thus takes her feelings to be personal revelation that she is not the gender assigned at birth. This seems perfectly reasonable according to the claimed Mormon doctrine and practice. But then the proclamation has the effect of placing the doctor's gender assignment over Indra's own gender assignment. Since the doctor is not necessarily a church member, and even if they are, they wouldn't be acting in that capacity, the church is putting the doctor's rather random assignment, because measuring with the ruler is rather random, over Indra's deepest feelings about herself. This move belies the church's commitment to personal revelation. The case of Indra can be generalized to cover all trans members. Remember, Indra is actually trans by definition, as well as being intersex, but not all trans people are intersex, of course. So can't a trans member say the same thing? Their experience of gender dysphoria on the one hand, and then later after transition gender euphoria on the other hand, it's personal revelation of the gender of their spirit. If there's anything about which a member of the church should be able to receive personal revelation, it would be about one's own identity, one's gender identity in particular. But of course, the church rejects this, and in so doing, takes back the commitment to personal revelation. This is an instance of equivocal gaslighting in that the church both asserts and doesn't assert that members have the right to personal revelation. Now, we can see that equivocal gaslighting has some interesting features. Changing the meaning of what you say or assert has the benefit of allowing you to avoid unforeseen and unacceptable consequences of the original meaning. But if you engage in this form of gaslighting, you are treating your interlocutor as having a fundamentally flawed misunderstanding of the language, when in fact they don't. When your meaning shifts with the winds of criticism or consequences, you are discoursing in bad faith. And this undermines the agency of your interlocutor by making it impossible for them to criticize or draw implications from what you say. You never really mean what you say. Equivocal gaslighting is clearly a case of testimonial injustice and epistemic violence. Now, in the case of the LDS Church, this violence is directed toward the LGBTQIA community, among others, probably Black and Indigenous people of color. And so it's no surprise that there was a study conducted at BYU not too long ago, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, that showed that almost 70% of LGBTQ people that were raised in the LDS Church fit the diagnostic criteria for PTSD and or CPTSD. And everyone in the Mormon community knows that the suicide rate among LGBTQ folk in Utah is high. Epistemic violence takes a toll on one's psychological health. And if it is part of a doxastic economy, as it is in the case of Mormonism, then that economy is violent and vicious. Thank you for coming to my Sunstone talk. So I can take questions now. The reading time was shorter than I thought it would be, so we have plenty of time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you. That was amazing. I loved all of your examples and connections. Do you have a source for the 70% PTSD statistic? Did you say that was from BYU?
Yeah, that's it. I have to go track the source down, but it was a study that was done at BYU. But I actually don't, in this draft of the paper, I haven't put that citation in yet. So I can't look it up right now. I'd have to go find it.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's fine. This is just a question that I have as we're waiting for some of the questions to roll in. Some of the examples that you were giving reminded me of spiritual bypassing, like the story you gave of, a child dying and people saying, oh, well, you should, they're going to be missionaries in heaven. How do you think, well, what is your understanding of spiritual bypassing, and how does this connect to that gaslighting?
Yeah, so spiritual bypassing is, can you define what you mean by that?
At least what I understand is kind of sidestepping difficult topics and just leaning on like spiritual ideas or religious ideas, like, there's a reason for everything when, somebody goes through like a miscarriage or a divorce or something like that. Like how does spiritual bypassing kind of tie into this idea of gaslighting?
Yeah. Well, okay, so it seems to me that there's going to be a material overlap between them. In other words, there's going to be a lot of cases of gaslighting that are also spiritual bypassing. And what I'm trying to figure out is whether or not one of them is contained in the other, right? Like whether spiritual bypassing is always a form of gaslighting or not. And I would have to think about some more examples of spiritual bypassing. I've been thinking a lot about gaslighting examples, but the concept of spiritual bypassing I haven't been working with, although I've heard it, but so that's not something I've thought a lot about. It's a good question though, because I mean, there's something in gaslighting that it essentially makes it, the gaslighter is denying the personhood of the gaslit, right? And in essence, then bypassing their real spiritual difficulty or problem or whatever it is that's happening is like that. You're denying their personhood to some extent, just treating them as a cog in the theological machine. And I'm going to give you a pat answer. I'm not going to respond to you as a person, right? And I think that gaslighting is trying to do that for sure. So there's definitely, I don't know if they're identical or if one is containing the other, but there's definitely a large overlap between those kinds of activities, I think.
Awesome, thank you. There are a couple people asking, where can we read your paper?
So this paper is in its infancy. I just started doing work on it this summer. I decided spontaneously to write this paper. I thought it would be, I thought I could write like a 4,000 word paper on this topic and have it complete and be done. But it's actually, I've opened up a can of worms, as is common when you open up something that has to do with trauma, right? And so it's going to be bigger than this. I'm thinking there's a neat anthology on philosophy of religion being put together of just women authors, and this is probably going to go in that anthology. I don't know where that's going to be published, but it could be Rutledge or Oxford or somewhere like that. So it's going to be a while before that process happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
If they look at your bio at your work at the UVU, would that be available?
Yeah. I will probably upload it when I have a working draft, I'll upload it to my academia.edu page.
Awesome. What needs to be done to stop gaslighting? What policies need to be implemented?
Oh, whoa. Yeah. Like, well, okay, so I assume that the question is about the church and the Mormon culture. Like what? I don't know that you're going to like my answer. I suspect that gaslighting is really deeply intertwined in Mormon theology. And I don't know that you can totally get it out. But just to show you where it's pretty clear I'm not a believing Mormon anymore. I'm post-Mormon, right? Obviously. I use Mormonism as my example when I'm thinking about issues in the philosophy of religion. This is one issue that's kind of a hot topic right now, and so I've been thinking about it. I actually suspect that it's that way in that I would end up concluding that this is true of most Abrahamic theistic traditions and not just Mormonism. That there's, I kind of want to say that the Akeda is a really problematic story, and is part of, and by the Akeda, I'm talking about, the Abraham being told to kill his son, sacrifice his son, that story. And then of course later, Nephi being told to kill Laban. That is the Mormon kind of version of that story, right? It seems to me that there's something toxic about those stories. And I suspect that a lot of problems in the Abrahamic theistic traditions come from the fact that they have the Akeda at the outset. And I want to look at the Akeda from the point of view of the son. And when I look at it from the point of view of the son, the father is abusing him and justifying it in a way that is deeply problematic. And then you get Joseph Smith doing that kind of stuff. Actually using that story as justification for the demands he makes on other members, other leaders, and women, and girls. So asking how to get it out, I don't know. They would have to, the very existence of the Proclamation on the Family gaslights the LGBTQ community. They'd have to get rid of the Proclamation on the Family. Mormonism can't be acceptable to me until that's gone.
This question kind of ties into this. Do you think that the church will ever improve on these issues? Do you think that there's a chance that some of these changes can happen?
I don't know. I don't know the future. I used to believe that it could, and that was why I stayed, right? I stayed in the church even though I was always heterodox. And I always tried to articulate an alternative perspective, into an alternative way of seeing the theology that didn't have the negative implications that I was getting from the dominant way of seeing it. And I respect people who are in the heterodox Mormon tradition trying to make a go of it, because there is so much about it that's also great. My politics is very influenced by the Book of Mormon, actually. I'm a socialist because of the Book of Mormon, because of people like Hugh Nibley reading it correctly instead of reading it in the crap way that the current church reads it. But I left because I didn't think I could do it, that this could be done, right? It's too much of a burden. And so now I'm kind of looking back at Mormonism from the perspective of an outsider, And I would want to say there are certain things about the theology that have to change. And this is true of not just Mormonism, but other Christian churches that use teleological theodicy. In other words, the idea that evil happens because it makes us better people, or it's part of God's plan somehow, it's for the greater good. That just is gaslighting everybody, right? You're telling them that their feelings, their way of reacting to these horrible events that happen in their lives is kind of not really justified because it's all part of the plan. And that's fundamentally flawed, but it's really deeply embedded in the Christian perspective and in, of course, also the Mormon perspective. But there are Christians, there are even Christian denominations, and there are Mormons, and even a Mormon denomination, kind of Mormon denomination, that avoid these kinds of practices. So I would say, look at, the Community of Christ, or the United Church of Christ, or the Unitarian Church, and see if they're able to avoid this kind of stuff. That would be, for me, religiously, I'm no longer interested in theism or theistic organizations, but there are some which do not offend me, right? And an example would be the Community of Christ. I would feel perfectly safe and included to attend one of their meetings, or the Unitarian Church or the United Church of Christ, right? Because they understand their religion in a way that's inclusive instead of understanding it in a way that's exclusive. And really, it's the need to have the exclusivity that leads to the need for gaslighting and passive aggression, covert aggression, and spiritual sidelining. Is that what it was called? Because exclusion requires this kind of, a black and white way of thinking, because you've got to say who is excluded, right? You have to define who is excluded. And it then sets up a hierarchy when you have that, when you have this black and white thinking. So the white is the good, the black is the bad. And, this is anybody who's this way is in the black category. And so we have this kind of, binary structure. Well, the people here in this category, in the white category, are going to have to, gaslight the people in the black category into being okay with the fact that that's the category that they're in. They're going to have to try to convince them. There's like an ideological propaganda war that's going on, right? And so I think if you have a religious community that's exclusivist, it's all about exclusion, you're going to end up with these kinds of things. But if you have one that's about inclusion and listening and tolerance, then I don't think you would.
Awesome, thank you. We've got several questions that have come up, so we can take some time. We've got about 6 minutes left. We can take some time on a couple or kind of do rapid fire, but whatever you're comfortable with. Here's one. I'm trying to stay engaged at church because I want to be the change I want to see. I've been struggling to reconcile that my choice to stay is a form of gaslighting to those who are harmed by the church. What advice do you have for someone like me?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
I have actually, in another version of this paper, I had to cut it down so that it was the right size to read. I actually included talking a little bit about what used to be called the liberal Mormon community back in the day when, when I was a heterodox Mormon still. Because there is some gaslighting that goes on from the progressive Mormon community, from people who are, and like, for example, here's an example. In I don't think this is as egregious as the kind of examples I've been talking about, but it is an example. Someone might say to somebody like me, I was a trans woman, I was a closeted trans woman, although some people kind of knew, but in the church, and people would say to me, don't leave, we need people like you in the church, because if people like you leave, the church will get worse, so stay. But of course, staying harmed me, right? And so there could very well be an element of gaslighting that's going on in that. So I was thinking a little bit about that. Well, here's an example. If somebody who's doesn't buy the orthodox line in Mormonism says, well, Mormonism is really about this. It's really, the leaders get this wrong. It's really about this. And we should, just all fight for that and stay in the church and fight for that. That's kind of gaslighting, because specifically if it was with respect to LGBTQ issues, you might encourage people to stay because it's really about this, right? But in fact, there might be some abstract, esoteric, theological way in which it's about that, but practically, the LDS Church and the LDS, community is actually, about exclusion in practice. And whatever Oakes's latest interpretation of the Proclamation on the Family is, that's what contemporary LDS Mormonism is. And so, I want to acknowledge the heterodox views, but at the same time say, look, the orthodoxy hurts people like me. And so if I were a member still, and I wanted to still make a go of it, I would say to people who are LGBTQ, I would say, I've never seen anybody stay in the church and be happy who's trans or queer. So by all means, get out. I wish people had said that to me back in the 90s when, I was going through, like an awakening period of time. It might, things might have been a little bit easier, but I was encouraged to stay. And I did for a lot longer than I should have.
Thank you. Although Oakes has declared what gender means, has any further official declaration happened? Believing trans and non-binary members probably hope for official clarification. Not sure if you're aware of anything.
Yeah, no, not yet. I follow this because I try to keep on top of what they're doing with respect to especially trans folk. I don't think has been any further clarification, but there will have to be, because the way that the whole process is so ad hoc. Like the proclamation was written without ever consulting anybody that was trans. They never talked to anybody that was trans, obviously. We know that they didn't, because if they had, then they would have written it in a different way. They would have had to. So they were completely ignoring, and also I should say, because I really want to emphasize this, they didn't talk to anybody that was intersex either. They must not have, right? Because it might seem like the church isn't excluding intersex folk, but they are. They're gaslighting them. And intersex folk who are trans, everybody wants to say, with respect to them, everybody wants to say, well, yeah, the doctor got it wrong. So it's kind of weird that with respect to trans folk who say, hey, wait, the doctor got it wrong, even though my genitalia is one way, that's not how I identify. It's kind of weird that you wouldn't then accept that, right? Sorry, I feel like I've got off on a tangent.
No, that was great. Well, we are done with our time. There are some more questions in the app. If you are able to get to them, you can make some responses to people. But yeah, we will close. Thank you so much. I know many of us really appreciate this, and thank you for your work and all that you're doing to bring this to light. So
Thank you for having me.
and everyone else, enjoy your lunch break. Enjoy the rest of this afternoon for the ending of Sunstone. Have a great day. Bye.